At 18 years old, Miriam Holloway had nowhere left to sleep after her uncle Ezekiel drove her from his farmhouse for refusing to sign away the last paper proving her late father's claim. And with only $5 folded inside her worn coat, she bought an abandoned church on the edge of Ashbriar Hollow for exactly that amount, a decision every soul in town called the greatest act of foolishness they had ever witnessed, never imagining that something long sealed beneath its forgotten altar had waited through decades of dust to change not only the course of her own life, but the fate of every family still clinging to that weary valley. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Miriam Holloway. If you are watching from a place others have forgotten, tell us where it is in the comments, because every forgotten place carries a story worth hearing. There are towns that disappear because rivers dry, because railroads change direction, or because mines surrender the last of their promise. Yet there are other towns that begin fading, long before any of those things happen. And we have always believed they begin to vanish the moment their people stop believing tomorrow can arrive, carrying anything better than yesterday. Ashbriar Hollow rested in one such valley, where pine-covered ridges stood like patient guardians around narrow fields stitched together by stone fences, built by hands already returned to the earth. The mornings smelled of cedar sap and damp soil, the evenings carried wood smoke through crooked lanes, and every church bell once echoed from hillside to hillside, until children learned to count the hours by sound rather than by clocks. Miriam Holloway entered that valley during one of the brightest Aprils anyone could remember. Her mother used to laugh that robins began singing earlier simply because they wished to greet her daughter first, while her father insisted the child had inherited the stubbornness of the hills themselves. Neither parent owned much beyond calloused hands, weathered furniture, and a modest patch of farmland that yielded enough corn, beans, and potatoes to survive each winter without begging favors from neighbors. Yet those who visited their home rarely remembered the worn floors or patched roof. They remembered kindness. Her father, Samuel Holloway, possessed the quiet habit of repairing what others discarded. A cracked wagon wheel, a broken lantern, a bent horseshoe, a splintered rocking chair, all somehow found new life beneath his patient hands. He often told his daughter that the world judged too quickly because broken things frightened people into believing they were looking at their own future. "Never ask whether something still has value," he would say while smoothing rough timber with an old plane whose handle had been polished by years of use. "Ask whether someone has taken enough time to discover where that value has been hiding." Those words settled inside Miriam long before she understood them. Whenever neighbors abandoned machinery beyond repair, Samuel walked the dusty roads collecting forgotten pieces, laying every bolt, spring, hinge, and gear upon his workbench until the barn resembled a museum dedicated to objects nobody else wanted. Young Miriam spent countless afternoons handing him tools while sunlight drifted through wooden slats overhead, watching discarded iron become useful once more. He rarely hurried, rarely complained, and never mocked those who had thrown things away. "It costs nothing to look twice," he would remind her. Her mother, Eleanor, taught different lessons. Where Samuel repaired objects, Eleanor restored spirits. Their modest kitchen became a refuge for widows carrying loneliness heavier than firewood, travelers whose boots had surrendered to muddy roads, children frightened by harsh winters, and strangers whose names were forgotten almost as soon as they departed. Miriam learned that bread tasted sweeter when shared, and that dignity could survive poverty if kindness remained untouched. On Sunday afternoons, after services ended, Eleanor often carried baskets filled with fresh loaves to families too proud to admit hunger. She never announced charity, never expected gratitude, and never allowed Miriam to pity those receiving help. "Today they need us," Eleanor whispered once, as they crossed a frozen creek, carrying soup toward an aging blacksmith whose workshop had burned weeks earlier. "Tomorrow it may be us needing them." Pride builds lonely houses. Ashbriar Hollow had once revolved around St. Agnes Church, a white wooden sanctuary standing upon a gentle rise overlooking the valley. Weddings, harvest festivals, funerals, baptisms, and Christmas gatherings had all filled its pews for generations. Its pastor knew every family by name. Children chased butterflies beneath its oak trees, and travelers measured their journeys by the sight of its steeple rising above morning mist. Miriam loved the church not because it appeared grand, but because it felt welcoming. Sunlight spilled through colored glass onto worn pine floors. Dust floated through warm beams like tiny stars, and old hymns lingered inside the rafters long after voices had fallen silent. Sometimes she remained after services simply listening to quiet settle around her. Pastor Nathaniel Pierce often found her sitting alone in the final pew. You listen as though the building is speaking, he observed one afternoon. It is, Miriam answered without embarrassment. And what does it say? That somebody built it, hoping strangers would become neighbors. The old pastor smiled for a long while before replying. Never stop hearing that. Those conversations shaped her more deeply than sermons. Years slipped gently across the valley until hardship arrived without invitation. First came a summer drought that cracked fields into pale patterns. Crops failed. Then fever visited neighboring settlements before reaching Ashbriar Hollow itself. Families closed shutters. Physicians exhausted every remedy they possessed. And church bells began tolling far too often. Eleanor Holloway succumbed before autumn leaves had fully changed. Samuel survived only 6 months longer. Grief transformed their cheerful farmhouse into a place where silence lingered in every doorway. At 16, Miriam buried both parents within sight of the church they had loved, carrying herself with remarkable composure, because sorrow had left no strength for dramatic tears. The townspeople admired her courage while quietly wondering how any girl so young might continue alone. Samuel's younger brother, Ezekiel Holloway, soon arrived, carrying promises wrapped in polished words. You'll stay with my family, he assured. Everyone gathered after the funeral. My brother would expect no less. The valley praised his generosity. Only time revealed its price. Unlike Samuel, Ezekiel measured worth through ownership. Fields existed to produce profit, neighbors represented opportunity, and every conversation somehow drifted toward land boundaries, debts, or inheritance. He believed compassion weakened practical judgment. Miriam entered his household believing family meant safety. Instead, she discovered obligation. From sunrise until darkness settled across the valley, she cooked meals, scrubbed floors, tended livestock, mended clothing, and harvested crops, while Ezekiel's own children attended school or wandered fields without responsibility. She accepted each task without complaint, because gratitude still outweighed exhaustion. Yet gratitude gradually encountered suspicion. Samuel's modest property remained legally unresolved after his death, because an aging surveyor had never completed updated records confirming old boundary lines established decades earlier. Most people considered the paperwork little more than forgotten county business. Ezekiel did not. He visited the courthouse repeatedly, returning each time more impatient. There are signatures still required, he muttered over supper one evening. Miriam looked up from washing dishes. What signatures? Yours. She dried her hands. For what? To simplify matters. He placed several folded papers upon the table without meeting her eyes. You've no need for land you cannot manage. She remembered her father's habit of reading every document slowly, twice if necessary. I'll read them first. His expression hardened almost invisibly. They're ordinary transfer papers. Then reading them won't take long. She carried the documents toward her room beneath the sloping attic roof, where moonlight entered through a small window overlooking distant hills. The language confused her at first, but one sentence appeared unmistakably clear. By signing, she would surrender every remaining claim connected to Samuel Holloway's farm, including mineral rights, water access, and adjacent acreage whose exact boundaries remained under review. She folded the papers carefully. The following morning, she returned them unsigned. I can't. Ezekiel's patience vanished. You ungrateful girl. They belong to Father. They belong to whoever can keep them productive. They're still his. They're yours only on paper. She looked steadily toward him. Then let them remain mine on paper. The room fell silent enough for the kitchen clock to become unbearably loud. From that day onward, the atmosphere within the farmhouse shifted like weather before a storm. Chores multiplied. Meals grew smaller. Conversations disappeared almost entirely. Miriam sensed something moving beneath the surface of ordinary days, though she could not yet see its shape, and each evening, she found herself looking toward the distant steeple of St. Agnes Church, wondering why it seemed lonelier than she remembered, unaware that both her own future and the forgotten future of the entire valley were already beginning to gather beneath its weathered roof. The weeks that followed unfolded with the slow certainty of winter, creeping across an open field. Nothing inside Ezekiel Holloway's house changed quickly enough for neighbors to notice, yet everything changed enough for Miriam to feel it with every passing day. A second helping at supper quietly disappeared. Her blankets, once thick enough to soften cold nights beneath the attic roof, were claimed for younger cousins because they were said to need them more. Chores that had once filled daylight now stretched into darkness. Before dawn, she milked cows, hauled water from the creek, split kindling, prepared breakfast, scrubbed pots, washed clothing against a wooden board until her fingers cracked, then spent afternoons repairing fences before returning to the kitchen long after everyone else had eaten. Whenever anyone from town stopped by, Ezekiel transformed into the picture of generous kinship. "We're doing everything we can for the poor girl," he would sigh with practiced sadness. "She still misses her parents terribly." People nodded with sympathy. No one remained long enough to see Miriam finishing work beneath lantern light after the visitors had gone. Still, she refused bitterness. Her mother's voice lingered inside her memory whenever discouragement threatened to settle too deeply. "Poverty can empty a cupboard," Eleanor had once whispered while kneading bread beside the kitchen window. "But only we decide whether it empties our hearts." So Miriam greeted each morning with quiet resolve. She found small reasons to remain hopeful. A bluebird nesting beneath the barn eaves, wildflowers pushing through rocky soil, the familiar sound of Pastor Nathaniel's bell drifting across the valley every Sunday morning. Hope, she discovered, rarely arrived as something grand. More often it appeared disguised as ordinary beauty refusing to surrender. Yet another force had begun moving quietly through Ashbriar Hollow. The railroad that once supplied nearby settlements had chosen a newer route beyond the eastern ridge, carrying merchants, travelers, and opportunity away from the valley. Businesses struggled. Young families departed. Storefront windows remained dark longer after sunset. Even St. Agnes Church had begun showing signs of neglect. Donations dwindled. Repairs were postponed. The once white paint peeled beneath years of rain and mountain wind. Pastor Nathaniel grew noticeably older. His sermons became shorter. His cough lingered longer. One chilly October afternoon, Miriam carried 2 loaves of fresh bread toward the church, hoping to surprise the elderly minister. She found him standing alone beside the weathered front steps, staring toward the valley below, as though trying to remember another landscape entirely. "You've come bearing blessings again," he smiled. "I thought perhaps you had forgotten to eat." "I nearly had." She handed him the basket. "Mother used to say, 'Shepherds forget themselves while caring for sheep.'" The old pastor laughed softly. "Your mother was wiser than many theologians." They sat together beneath the enormous oak whose branches shaded generations of worshippers. "The town feels different," Miriam admitted. "It does. Can it be restored?" Nathaniel remained silent long enough for autumn leaves to drift across the churchyard. "Buildings can," he answered carefully. "Communities require something harder." "What is that?" "Someone willing to believe restoration is possible before anyone else does." She lowered her eyes. "I don't think I'm that someone." "Perhaps not today." His gaze rested upon the church doors. But strange things happen when ordinary people remain faithful to ordinary goodness. Those words settled inside her without explanation. She noticed him looking toward the sanctuary again. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated. "The church trustees have been meeting." "About repairs? About selling?" The words struck harder than she expected. "Selling St. Agnes?" "Attendance has fallen. Roof beams need replacing. The furnace scarcely survives each winter. But where will everyone gather?" He smiled sadly. "That is the question no ledger knows how to answer." Weeks later, the answer came. Pastor Nathaniel Pierce died peacefully in his sleep, before the first heavy snow. Nearly the entire valley attended his funeral. Voices filled the sanctuary one final time, hymns echoing beneath the rafters exactly as they had during Miriam's childhood. When the final prayer ended, people lingered longer than usual, reluctant to leave the building because some instinct whispered they might never stand together inside it again. They were right. Without Nathaniel's steady leadership, disagreement spread quickly among the remaining trustees. Some wished to preserve the church regardless of cost. Others insisted practical realities mattered more than sentiment. Attendance continued falling. Repairs multiplied faster than donations. By spring, St. Agnes closed its doors. Its bell never rang again. Grass crept across the front path. Dust settled over pews, where generations had celebrated births and mourned losses. Children who had once raced beneath the oak now crossed the road without looking toward the abandoned building. Miriam avoided passing it whenever possible. The silence hurt too deeply. Meanwhile, Ezekiel's impatience hardened into determination. County surveyors finally announced they would revisit old property records throughout the valley. Rumors spread that forgotten claims might prove unexpectedly valuable, because new geological studies suggested unusually rich limestone and underground springs beneath several neglected farms. Ezekiel became almost feverishly interested. One rainy evening, he entered the kitchen carrying another collection of documents. "We're settling this tonight." Miriam recognized the folded papers immediately. "I already answered." "You answered foolishly." "I answered honestly." His wife remained motionless beside the stove. His children quietly slipped from the room. Ezekiel placed an ink bottle upon the table. "You sign." She stood without moving closer. "No." His voice lowered. "You have eaten beneath my roof. I've worked beneath it. I've clothed you. I've earned those clothes. I've protected you." She looked directly into his eyes. "You've tried to own me." Silence crashed across the kitchen. For several heartbeats, neither spoke. Then Ezekiel swept the papers from the table. "You sound exactly like your father." She almost smiled. "I hope so." His face flushed crimson. If Samuel had possessed an ounce of practical sense, he wouldn't have died leaving nothing. He left integrity. Integrity doesn't plow fields. No, it doesn't pay taxes. No, it doesn't keep roofs standing. She answered quietly. It keeps people standing. Those words ended every possibility of peace. The next morning, she discovered her belongings stacked beside the front porch. A single worn suitcase, 2 blankets, her father's toolbox, a small wooden Bible that had belonged to Eleanor, nothing more. Ezekiel stood in the doorway. "If you're determined to own land, find somewhere else to sleep on it." She waited. Part of her believed compassion might still return to him. Instead, he tossed $5 silver onto the porch boards. "That's all your share amounts to." The coins rolled unevenly before coming to rest near her boots. $5. The entire inheritance of her parents' lives had become $5 silver and a suitcase. She bent slowly, picked up each coin, and placed them carefully into her coat pocket. "I'll pray for you," she said. He laughed. "You'll need those prayers more than I will." The door closed. Miriam stood alone beneath gray skies, while a cold wind carried dead leaves across the yard. She did not knock again. By sunset, she had walked nearly 7 miles, carrying everything she owned. The boarding house charged more than she possessed. The general store had no work. The blacksmith apologized with genuine regret. "I've barely enough business to feed myself." She thanked him anyway. Night settled over the valley. Without family or shelter, she spread one blanket beneath the awning of the abandoned freight depot and wrapped the second around her shoulders. Freight trains no longer stopped there. Only echoes remained. She listened to distant coyotes calling from wooded hills and wondered whether 18 years could truly contain enough living for one lifetime. Morning brought stiff muscles and fresh determination. She searched for employment in neighboring settlements, washed dishes in exchange for lunch, helped an elderly widow repair storm-damaged fencing for supper, and slept wherever weather permitted. 3 weeks passed. The $5 remained untouched. Whenever hunger tempted her to spend them, she remembered her father's habit of waiting before using the final piece of timber in his workshop. "The last piece deserves the wisest purpose," he used to say. She had no idea what wise purpose $5 might someday serve. The answer arrived unexpectedly on a windy afternoon outside the county courthouse. Several trustees from St. Agnes stood speaking with the county clerk while examining faded maps. Curiosity drew Miriam closer. "No one wants it," one trustee muttered. "The roof leaks. The foundation's sinking. The windows are broken. We're paying taxes on an empty building." The clerk shrugged. "If nobody bids, the county will eventually reclaim it." An elderly trustee sighed. "We'd practically give the place away." Those words stirred something impossible inside Miriam. She stepped forward hesitantly. "Would you?" 4 men turned. Recognition crossed their faces. "Samuel Holloway's girl. You've grown. What brings you here?" She swallowed carefully. "You said you'd give it away." One trustee smiled sadly. "Figure of speech. What would it actually cost?" They exchanged amused glances. Finally, the eldest answered, $5. Someone chuckled. "No sensible person would pay even that." Another added gently, "It should probably be torn down." Miriam looked beyond them. Through courthouse windows, she could just make out the distant steeple rising above pine trees. She remembered stained glass glowing across wooden floors. She remembered her mother's hymns. She remembered Pastor Nathaniel saying communities required someone willing to believe restoration was possible before anyone else did. She remembered her father asking where value had been hiding. $5 suddenly felt less like money and more like an answer waiting years to be understood. The trustees assumed she remained silent because the price shocked her. Instead, she reached into her coat. One by one, she placed the 5 silver coins upon the clerk's desk. "I'll buy it." Nobody laughed immediately. Their surprise proved too complete. The clerk blinked twice. "You understand this is St. Agnes Church?" "Yes. It hasn't been used in months." "I know. The roof leaks. I've seen it. The bell tower leans. I've noticed. There are bats." She almost smiled. "They lived there before I did." The oldest trustee leaned closer. "Young lady, where exactly do you intend to live?" She answered without hesitation. "There." Paperwork took less than an hour. By sunset, 18-year-old Miriam Holloway legally owned an abandoned church standing upon nearly 2 acres of neglected land. The entire valley learned before darkness fell. Some pitied her. Others shook their heads. Several declared grief had finally clouded her judgment. Even Ezekiel laughed openly when he heard. She traded her last dollar for a collapsing chapel. No one imagined history had quietly shifted. Miriam climbed the church steps, carrying her father's toolbox beneath one arm and her single suitcase beneath the other. The front doors groaned as though awakening from a long sleep. Dust drifted through fading sunlight. Broken pews rested beneath white sheets of cobwebs. Wind whispered through cracked, stained glass windows, carrying the scent of old pine, damp wood, candle wax, and forgotten prayers. She did not see ruin. She saw possibility. Before unpacking anything, she walked slowly toward the altar where Pastor Nathaniel had preached for decades. She knelt, closed her eyes, and thanked God simply for a roof, however damaged, above her head. When she rose, the heel of her boot caught against one unusually smooth section of the worn wooden floor, directly before the altar rail. It did not creak like the surrounding boards. Instead, it answered with a strangely deep, hollow sound that echoed beneath the sanctuary for just a heartbeat longer than it should have. And somewhere beneath the floor, almost too faint to distinguish from imagination itself, came the soft, metallic clink of iron touching iron. Miriam remained perfectly still. The faint metallic sound beneath the altar vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the restless whisper of wind slipping through cracked stained glass. She slowly lowered herself onto one knee and pressed her palm against the worn plank. The timber felt smoother than every surrounding board, as though countless footsteps had polished it through decades. Yet beneath that familiar surface rested a hollow unlike any other in the sanctuary. She tapped lightly with the handle of her father's hammer. Once again the sound answered, not solid, but deep, restrained, almost protective. Samuel Holloway had taught her long ago that wood spoke differently, depending upon what lay beneath it, and she trusted those lessons more than appearances. Rather than forcing the plank open in excitement, she marked the spot with a small piece of blue chalk from her father's toolbox. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "We'll understand tomorrow." She had learned that hurried hands often ruined discoveries patient hands could preserve. The following morning sunlight poured through fractured stained glass, scattering faded colors across the dusty floor. Miriam swept the sanctuary before doing anything else. Every stroke of the broom uncovered another reminder that this building had once gathered hundreds of hopeful voices. Beneath layers of dust appeared polished pine, worn smooth by generations of boots. Old hymn books emerged from beneath collapsed pews. A brass candle holder, blackened by age, waited quietly beneath fallen plaster. She repaired what little she could before returning to the chalk mark. Using a pry bar from Samuel's toolbox, she carefully eased upward on the board. At first, nothing moved. Nails complained but refused surrender. She worked more patiently, loosening each edge rather than forcing the center. Finally, the plank lifted just enough to reveal darkness beneath. A cool breath of air escaped from below, carrying the scent of old cedar, dry stone, and something strangely untouched by time. She widened the opening enough to peer inside. Instead of bare earth, she found carefully laid stone steps descending into darkness. She stared for several long moments. Churches often possessed crawl spaces beneath their floors, but these steps had clearly been built for people, not maintenance. Someone had intended this hidden passage to be entered. Yet no record in town had ever mentioned such a place. She climbed back into the sanctuary and replaced the board exactly as she had found it. Curiosity urged her downward immediately, but another lesson from Samuel returned. When you discover something hidden, first ask why someone wanted it hidden. That afternoon, she walked into town hoping to learn more before venturing below. Most people barely acknowledged her greeting. News of her purchasing the abandoned church had spread faster than wildfire. Two boys sitting outside the mercantile laughed openly as she passed. "There goes the church girl," one called. "Maybe the ghosts pay rent." Several older men exchanged amused smiles. One woman quietly crossed the street to avoid conversation. Miriam continued walking without lowering her eyes. Inside the general store, old Mrs. Larkin measured flour behind the counter. Unlike most, she greeted Miriam kindly. "You've chosen a difficult home." Miriam smiled gently. Most worthwhile homes seem to begin that way. The elderly woman studied her for a moment. "You're looking for answers." "About St. Agnes." Mrs. Larkin leaned closer. "You should visit Mr. Alden Mercer, the former stonemason. He's 90 if he's a day, helped build half this valley before arthritis claimed his hands. Would he remember the church?" Mrs. Larkin gave a quiet laugh. "Child, he helped lay its foundation." Miriam found Alden Mercer living alone in a weather-beaten cabin overlooking the northern ridge. Age had bent his shoulders, but not dimmed his remarkable memory. When she explained why she had come, he remained silent for a long while before inviting her inside. His tiny home smelled of cedar smoke and old books. "You own St. Agnes now?" he asked. "Yes." "Interesting. Why?" He stirred the fire thoughtfully. "Because the last person who asked me about that building was Pastor Nathaniel, nearly 15 years ago." Miriam leaned forward. "What did he ask?" "Whether I remembered something unusual beneath the altar." Her heartbeat quickened, though she kept her expression calm. "What did you tell him?" Alden frowned toward distant memories. "When we built the church, the architect insisted on constructing a stone chamber beneath the sanctuary before the wooden floor was installed. For what purpose? He never explained. Did no one question him? In those days, people trusted builders more than they questioned them. Who was the architect? Edwin Harcourt. The name meant nothing to Miriam. Did he live here? No. Arrived by train. Stayed several months. Left before the dedication. Alden reached slowly toward a dusty shelf and removed a leather-bound notebook. Its pages had yellowed with age. "I've kept notes on every building I ever helped construct." He turned carefully until stopping midway through the book. "Here." Miriam read his neat handwriting. "St. Agnes Church. Foundation completed September 3rd. Stone chamber beneath sanctuary constructed according to architect's private measurements. Entry sealed before dedication. No explanation provided. Workers instructed never to discuss additional chamber." Miriam looked up. "Why would anyone build a hidden room beneath a church?" Alden closed the notebook gently. "That question has troubled me for 60 years. She thanked him and prepared to leave, but the old mason stopped her. "Miss Holloway?" "Yes?" "Whatever you find down there." He hesitated. "Remember that some things are hidden to protect people. Others are hidden from people. Knowing which is which may prove more important than the discovery itself." Those words accompanied her all the way back to the church. Evening settled across Ashbriar Hollow beneath gathering clouds. Rather than waiting until morning, Miriam lit 2 lanterns, gathered rope, matches, chalk, her father's notebook, and every useful tool she possessed. She pried up the hidden floorboard once more and descended carefully into darkness. The stone staircase curved gently beneath the altar before opening into a narrow corridor lined with carefully fitted limestone blocks. Cobwebs hung untouched across the ceiling. Dust rested undisturbed upon every surface. No footprints marked the floor except her own. Whoever had last entered this passage had done so generations earlier. Her lantern cast trembling light ahead. 20 yards farther, the corridor ended at an enormous oak door reinforced with black iron straps. The hinges showed almost no rust despite the years. An iron keyhole rested beneath a tarnished brass plate bearing only 3 carved words. "For those who restore." Miriam traced the letters with her fingertips. She searched carefully but found no key. Instead, she noticed deep scratches around the latch, as though someone long ago had attempted unsuccessfully to force it open. She stepped backward, studying the mechanism. Samuel had always insisted locks revealed their secrets through patience rather than strength. After several minutes, she discovered a nearly invisible wooden peg hidden beneath the brass plate. Pressing it gently released an internal catch. The heavy lock clicked open by itself. The massive door groaned inward. Lantern light spilled into a surprisingly large stone chamber. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Wooden chests rested neatly arranged in rows. Metal filing cabinets stood beside carved oak cupboards. Everything remained astonishingly dry despite decades underground. Dust covered every surface, yet nothing appeared damaged. Miriam approached the nearest shelf. Leather-bound ledgers filled its compartments. She opened one carefully. Names. Hundreds of names. Beside each appeared dates, land descriptions, family histories, birth records, boundary surveys, loans repaid, wills, donations, property transfers, and handwritten notes spanning nearly 70 years. She opened another ledger, more names, another, more records. Then she noticed something extraordinary. Nearly every page contained signatures from families who had vanished from the valley decades earlier. This was not merely church bookkeeping. It was the complete memory of Ashbriar Hollow. Every promise, every agreement, every forgotten claim, every family story. Tears filled her eyes as realization slowly formed. If these records had survived while courthouse documents disappeared through fires, floods, or neglect, they could restore histories the town believed permanently lost. Yet the greatest discovery still waited. Against the far wall stood a single cedar chest unlike the others. Upon its lid rested the carved image of intertwined oak branches surrounding a small church bell. Inside lay dozens of sealed envelopes arranged alphabetically. The first she opened contained a deed. The second held survey maps. The third contained letters written by town founders describing water rights, charitable trusts, school funding, and land intentionally donated for public use. None of those donations had ever appeared in county records. Someone had deliberately preserved the originals here. Her breathing slowed as another possibility emerged. What if certain lands throughout Ashbriar Hollow had never legally belonged to the powerful families now claiming them? She continued reading until lantern light began fading. One folded packet bore a familiar name, Holloway. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside rested Samuel Holloway's father's original survey confirming boundaries older than any courthouse revision, along with detailed maps showing a freshwater spring extending far beyond Ezekiel's present property line. Attached to the packet lay a signed declaration from the church trustees, stating that the Holloway family had permanently retained mineral and water rights, regardless of future boundary disputes. Miriam closed her eyes. Her father had been telling the truth all along. The papers Ezekiel demanded she sign would have erased rights that had belonged to generations of her family. She carefully returned every document exactly where she had found it. Nothing about this discovery belonged to her alone. Dawn found her still seated inside the chamber, making careful notes by lantern light. She replaced the hidden floor before anyone could notice, and carried only her notebook upstairs. By midday, however, word had already begun spreading. Mrs. Larkin had innocently mentioned seeing Miriam visiting Alden Mercer. Someone else reported lantern light inside the abandoned church long after midnight. Curiosity transformed into suspicion with astonishing speed. By afternoon, several townsmen stood outside, watching the church from across the road. Ezekiel soon joined them. "She's digging for something," he muttered. One man laughed. "Probably rats." But Ezekiel did not laugh. He remembered the unsigned property papers. He remembered the survey disputes. Most of all, he remembered Samuel Holloway's confidence that certain truths outlive dishonest men. A quiet uneasiness settled over him. 2 evenings later, Miriam returned from gathering water to find muddy boot prints leading across the sanctuary floor. Someone had entered while she was away. Nothing appeared stolen, yet the hidden plank before the altar sat barely a finger's width out of place. Whoever had come had searched, and whoever had searched now knew the church was hiding something. Miriam did not rush to lift the hidden plank. Instead, she studied every muddy footprint crossing the sanctuary floor. Samuel Holloway had often reminded her that careless people left behind more truth than careful ones ever intended. The prints were broad, the heels deeply worn on the outer edge, and one sole carried a small crescent-shaped cut that appeared again and again across the dusty boards. Whoever had searched the church had not found the chamber, but they had come close enough to disturb the floor before giving up. She quietly swept away every mark except the single print she copied into her notebook. Then she replaced the chalk mark near the hidden entrance with another several feet away, creating a false point of interest should anyone return. For the next 3 days, she continued repairing broken pews, patching roof leaks with salvaged shingles, and clearing weeds from the churchyard, as though she had discovered nothing at all. Yet every evening she descended beneath the altar, carrying another armful of ledgers into the chamber, where she carefully compared names, dates, maps, and handwritten letters. A pattern slowly emerged. Edwin Harcourt, the architect who had designed St. Agnes, had never intended the chamber to protect treasure. He had built it to preserve truth. During the church's construction, a corrupt land syndicate had begun altering county records throughout the region, quietly transferring springs, grazing land, timber rights, and public trust properties into private ownership through forged surveys and missing documents. Harcourt, together with Pastor Elias Whitcomb, the church's first minister, had gathered the genuine deeds and records entrusted to families throughout the valley, sealing authenticated copies beneath the altar until a future generation might need them. One final letter rested inside a carved cedar box. Its seal remained unbroken. Miriam opened it with careful hands. "To the one who restores rather than possesses," it began. "If these words have reached your hands, then our fears have proven true. We have hidden these records because greed often survives longer than honesty. Someday a person will stand where we once stood and discover what was preserved beneath this sanctuary. We ask only this: use these papers not to enrich yourself, but to return every family to the truth that belongs to them. Let justice rebuild what deception has quietly stolen." Miriam folded the letter and sat in silence. She understood then why the chamber had been hidden beneath a church instead of a courthouse or bank. Buildings devoted to profit protected wealth. Buildings devoted to faith protected conscience. The discovery belonged to everyone. The following Sunday, although St. Agnes no longer held services, she climbed into the weathered bell tower carrying a length of new rope she had purchased after earning several dollars repairing fences for neighboring farms. The old bell had not rung in nearly 2 years. She cleaned its rusted wheel, fastened the rope, whispered a short prayer, and pulled with all the strength she possessed. The first note echoed uncertainly across Ashbriar Hollow. Birds lifted from pine trees. Windows opened throughout the valley. She pulled again, then again. Before long, the forgotten sound rolled across hillsides exactly as it had in generations past. Curious townspeople abandoned chores and followed the ringing toward the church. Within half an hour, nearly every family stood outside the weathered sanctuary. Ezekiel arrived near the front, his expression already suspicious. Miriam waited quietly until the murmuring settled. "Thank you for coming," she began. "I asked you here because St. Agnes has been keeping something that belongs to all of us." Confused whispers spread through the crowd. She continued calmly. "Not gold, not jewels, something far more valuable." Ezekiel stepped forward. "You've been digging beneath that building." "Yes. Then whatever you've found belongs to the church." Miriam looked toward the gathered trustees. "Does it?" The oldest trustee answered cautiously. "What exactly have you found?" Rather than explaining, she removed one carefully wrapped ledger and held it before everyone. The memory of this valley. Silence followed. Miriam invited the trustees, Mrs. Larkin, Alden Mercer, the county clerk, and every interested resident inside the sanctuary. Together they watched as she lifted the hidden floorboard. Gasps filled the room when the stone staircase appeared beneath the altar. Lanterns illuminated the chamber below while one person after another descended into the astonishing archive. The county clerk stood speechless before shelves stretching into darkness. Alden Mercer removed his hat in quiet respect. Mrs. Larkin wept openly while running trembling fingers across ledgers containing names of neighbors long buried. For hours they examined documents. Every new discovery confirmed the authenticity of the collection. Original surveys matched forgotten landmarks. Birth records resolved decades-old family disputes. Trust agreements revealed that land intended for the town school, cemetery expansion, and public well had never legally been transferred away. Then came the Holloway documents. The county clerk compared Samuel Holloway's original survey against courthouse copies. His face grew pale. "These courthouse records were altered," he whispered. Several survey markers had been deliberately shifted years earlier, expanding adjoining properties while reducing Samuel's land. The original boundaries proved unmistakable. Even more startling, multiple surrounding farms had suffered identical changes over several decades. Ezekiel's confidence slowly disappeared. There must be some mistake. The clerk looked at him gravely. "No. The mistake occurred many years ago." Within weeks, county officials reopened land investigations throughout Ashbriar Hollow. Surveyors returned carrying the original documents preserved beneath St. Agnes. Boundaries were corrected. Springs returned to the families who had always owned them. Community grazing land was restored. A charitable trust established by the valley's founders, believed lost for nearly 40 years, was recovered through letters preserved inside the cedar chest. The trust provided enough funds to repair roads, rebuild the neglected schoolhouse, and establish a permanent community library inside the restored church annex. The limestone spring beneath the Holloway property supplied clean water to nearly every household during the following dry summer. Because Miriam refused exclusive ownership, she donated public access exactly as her ancestors had originally intended. Reporters from neighboring counties traveled to Ashbriar Hollow to witness the remarkable discovery. They expected stories about buried riches, but instead found shelves filled with truth, patiently waiting beneath a forgotten altar. Many remarked that no treasure of silver or gold could have transformed an entire town more completely than honest records preserved by faithful hands. As investigations continued, officials quietly determined that Ezekiel had knowingly attempted to pressure Miriam into surrendering rights he suspected still existed. Though he had not forged the original records himself, he had tried to benefit from their disappearance. The court stripped away the improperly claimed acreage, returning it to its rightful owners. His reputation, once built upon appearances, dissolved with surprising speed. Yet when several neighbors spoke harshly against him, Miriam gently interrupted. "Justice has already spoken," she said. "We need not add cruelty." Those who heard her never forgot the quiet dignity with which she treated the man who had cast her into homelessness. Months passed. Volunteers filled St. Agnes once more. Carpenters repaired beams. Children polished pews. Stained glass returned to brilliant color. Women stitched new altar cloths. Men rebuilt the leaning bell tower. No one received wages. Every nail, every board, every coat of fresh white paint became an offering of gratitude. The hidden chamber remained beneath the sanctuary, though its entrance was strengthened and carefully documented, so future generations would never again lose what had been entrusted to them. Instead of hiding its existence, the community transformed it into an archive, preserving every important record created thereafter. They called it the Room of Restoration. Miriam refused every suggestion that it bear her name. "I only opened the door," she insisted. Many hands rebuilt what waited behind it. The trustees invited her to live permanently inside the restored parsonage beside the church, but she accepted only a modest room until enough money existed to establish an orphan home within the old residence. "No child who loses family," she explained, "should ever wonder where home has gone." Years later, children raised in that home would learn the story of the hidden chamber beneath the altar before they learned multiplication tables. They would grow believing that truth, though sometimes buried, never truly disappeared. And so we return to where we began. At 18 years old, Miriam Holloway stood homeless, with only $5, and a decision everyone else considered foolish. The world saw a collapsing church. She saw a place worth looking at twice. The world heard hollow boards and walked away. She knelt to listen. The world measured value by appearances. She remembered her father's quiet wisdom that broken things often concealed their greatest purpose beneath damaged surfaces. Had she spent those $5 on food, the hunger would have passed for a day. Had she purchased a bed, it might have offered a few nights of comfort. Instead, she bought hope disguised as ruin. Beneath an abandoned altar, she uncovered not riches for herself, but justice for an entire valley. Families reclaimed forgotten histories. Children inherited restored opportunities. A church once considered worthless again became the heart of a living community. The building had never truly been abandoned. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to believe that forgotten places still carried promises beneath their dust. Miriam's name gradually became part of Ashbriar Hollow itself, spoken whenever newcomers admired the church bell ringing across the valley or visited the archive beneath the sanctuary. Older residents smiled whenever they told the tale, because they understood the greatest miracle had not been the hidden chamber. It had been the young woman who chose restoration over revenge, generosity over ownership, and truth over profit. In doing so, she proved that quiet courage often changes history long before anyone notices it happening. Thank you for spending this time with us in Ashbriar Hollow, and for walking beside Miriam's remarkable journey. If her story touched your heart, we hope you'll share it with someone who needs a reminder that what the world dismisses may still hold extraordinary worth. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what is a time you discovered unexpected value in something others had written off? We always enjoy reading your stories. Until next time, stay close.
Before you go, thank you for spending this time in Ashbriar Hollow with Miriam. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And tell us in the comments, what is something others wrote off that later proved valuable? Until next time, stay close.